In the quiet fog of Berkshire's countryside, the Hartwell estate loomed, its windows like watching eyes. 5 women entered its gates as brides. All left the same way, screaming, raving, or silent with madness. Was it the house, the family, or something far older that cursed them? In the late autumn of 1792, the Hartwell estate stood like a sentinel over the rolling Berkshire countryside. From the village road, its tall chimneys pierced the grey sky, and its gables seemed to lean forward as though listening to the wind. The building's age was betrayed in the uneven stonework, the blackened beams, and the ivy that clung stubbornly to every wall. To some, it was a symbol of wealth and tradition. To others, it was a place best passed by without looking too long. It was to this estate that Margaret Fenwick arrived on a cold November afternoon, her carriage wheels crunching over the frost-bitten gravel. She was 22, a woman of striking beauty and a keen wit, daughter of a prosperous merchant family in London. Edward Hartwell, a man 10 years her senior, had courted her with polished manners and the promise of a life far removed from the soot and noise of the city. The villagers watched the carriage pass, their faces half hidden in scarves. Some nodded politely, others whispered as the wheels disappeared behind the estate gates. A few older women exchanged knowing glances. They remembered the stories, though none were willing to tell them to a stranger. Hartwell Hall, they said, had never been kind to the women who lived there. Margaret stepped down from the carriage and inhaled the sharp country air. The front doors swung open before she reached them, and Edward himself greeted her, tall, neatly dressed, his dark hair touched with early silver. Behind him the servants stood in a stiff line, their eyes careful, their expressions unreadable. The great hall was colder than she expected. The stone flags underfoot held the chill of centuries, and the scent of damp wood and long extinguished fires lingered. Sunlight filtered through tall, leaded windows, casting pale patterns across the walls. As Edward led her deeper into the house, her footsteps echoed in a way that made her think of empty cathedrals. Their wedding had been a modest affair, held 2 days earlier in London. Now, in this echoing space, Margaret felt the first tremor of something she could not name, a sensation that the house was not welcoming her so much as watching her. She brushed the thought aside. Edward's voice carried warmly as he spoke of the history of each room, the age of the furniture, the weight of the portraits, but the servants said nothing. When her eyes met theirs, most looked away. And so Margaret Fenwick crossed the threshold of Hartwell Hall as its new mistress, unaware that no Hartwell bride before her had left the house whole. The first nights at Hartwell Hall were marked by silence, a silence so complete that Margaret found herself straining to hear anything at all. In London, there had always been noise, the clatter of carriages, the calls of street vendors, the restless hum of life beyond the window panes. Here there was only the faint creak of beams settling in the cold, and the occasional cry of a night bird far across the fields. It was on the 4th night that she first heard it, a soft, irregular tapping, as if someone were drumming fingertips against wood. At first, she thought it was Edward returning late from his study, but when she rose from bed and listened at the door, the sound seemed to come from the walls themselves. 3 taps, then silence. A pause. 3 more. She waited, holding her breath, but the sound faded into stillness. The next day she mentioned it to the housemaid, Ellen, a quiet girl of perhaps 17. Ellen's vein tightened. "Old timbers, ma'am," she said quickly, eyes lowered. "They shift in the frost." But when Margaret pressed her, Ellen added, "Best not listen too closely to this house, if you take my meaning," before excusing herself to fetch fresh linens. That evening, Margaret dined alone, Edward having gone to visit a neighbour. The fire in the dining room crackled and hissed, but beyond it, she thought she heard a faint murmur. Not tapping this time, but voices, low and distant, like a conversation overheard through a closed door. She set down her fork and listened. It stopped the instant she moved her chair back. Later, in bed, she told herself it must be her imagination. The wind here could play strange tricks, curling around chimneys and sliding under doors. Still, she left one candle burning on the bedside table, unwilling to let the room sink into total darkness. By the week's end, the whispers had grown bolder. They came at odd hours, in the stillness before dawn, in the moment just before she drifted to sleep. She could never catch the words, only the rise and fall of them, as though spoken in another language. More than once, she awoke certain that someone had leaned close and breathed her name. Margaret told no one, not even Edward, but each night she lay very still, her eyes open in the candlelight, listening to the heartbeat of the house, and somewhere deep within the walls, something listened back. By the second month of her marriage, Margaret's nights had become an endurance. The whispers had not gone away. They had multiplied, grown closer, clearer. She now thought she could distinguish more than one voice, though their words still slipped from her grasp like water through her fingers. Sometimes they were joined by the faintest scrape, as though nails dragged slowly across plaster. Her reflection, once bright with confidence, now seemed pale and watchful in the looking-glass. Servants began to remark, in voices they thought she could not hear, that the mistress was fading. Her laughter had vanished. Her meals were barely touched. The frost-bitten January air filled the house with an aching cold, and even near the hearth she could not keep warm. It was in this state that Edward first found her sleepwalking. One bitter night, a maid discovered her in the orchard, barefoot in the snow, her nightdress torn, her hands hanging limp at her sides. She was staring at the dark branches as if waiting for someone to appear. They brought her inside, wrapped her in blankets, but she said nothing until morning. When she did speak, she claimed she had been called outside, though she could not name who, or what, had summoned her. Edward, ever practical, dismissed it as nerves. A new home, an unfamiliar place, it unsettles some, he told her, as though his calm could overwrite her fear. But Margaret knew what she felt, and it was no ordinary unease. The days grew shorter, and her behavior more erratic. Once, Ellen found her in the east corridor, pressing her ear to the wall and smiling faintly, as though listening to a secret joke. Another time she woke to find the door to her bedchamber wide open. The candle burned down to a pool of wax, and the scent of damp earth in the room, though the hearth was cold. Her final collapse came on a night of restless wind. Edward was woken by a scream so sharp it seemed to split the dark. He found her in the great hall, clawing at the paneling with her bare hands, shouting that the eyes in the walls would not stop watching her. Her voice was hoarse, her skin raw from her frantic scratching. Within a fortnight, Edward had her removed to an asylum in Oxfordshire, under the care of physicians who spoke of melancholia and hysteria. She never set foot in Hartwell Hall again, and in the empty halls, the whispers waited for the next bride. In the spring of 1796, Edward Hartwell married again. His new bride, Anne Pembroke, was a widow of 30 with a sharp mind and a reputation for forthrightness. She had managed her late husband's estate in Dorset with competence, and she carried herself as a woman who believed she could master any household, no matter its temperament. From the moment her carriage approached Hartwell Hall, she took in every detail with a critical eye. The ivy-strangled gables, the long shadow the building cast over its gardens, the faint dampness in the air. "A fine house," she declared to Edward upon stepping down. Yet the servants, who lined the drive as before, offered smiles that never reached their eyes. Inside she noticed the scent first. Not unpleasant, but old. A mingling of beeswax polish, charred wood, and something faintly metallic beneath it. The great hall seemed darker than the day outside should allow, and she was aware of a subtle chill that clung to the air, even as fires burned in the hearths. Anne wasted no time in asserting herself. She ordered new curtains for the drawing-room, had the silver polished until it gleamed, and dismissed any mention of superstition as the mutterings of idle staff. "This is a house, not a fable," she told Ellen, who still worked at Hartwell Hall and avoided the east wing whenever she could. But as weeks passed, Anne could not ignore certain peculiarities. The east wing, though structurally sound, was markedly colder than the rest of the house. Sometimes when she walked its corridor, the air carried a smell like wet stone after rain. Once she thought she heard faint footsteps behind her, though no one followed. It was during one such walk that she paused before a heavy oak door she had not seen before. Its iron keyhole was black with age, the handle cool beneath her touch. When she asked Edward about it that evening, his answer came too quickly. Storage, nothing of importance. She pressed him further, but he dismissed the matter with a smile that did not quite meet his eyes. One night, as she prepared for bed, Anne removed her wedding ring and set it on the table, while she brushed her hair. She was certain she replaced it on her finger before sleep. But when she awoke at dawn, the ring lay on her pillow, cold, perfectly centered, as though placed there by a careful hand. And somewhere in the east wing, a door seemed to be waiting. Anne's thoughts returned to the locked door in the east wing with increasing frequency. It was not merely curiosity, it was a gnawing insistence, a sense that the door was aware of her. Passing it in the daylight, she imagined she could feel a faint draught from beneath, carrying with it a smell unlike the rest of the house, old cloth, dust, and something faintly sweet, like rotting fruit. Edward avoided the subject altogether. When she mentioned it over supper, he steered the conversation to weather, politics, anything but the East Wing. This avoidance only sharpened her determination. One late afternoon, as rain lashed the windows and the servants busied themselves with closing shutters, Anne found Ellen in the scullery and asked casually where the key to the East Wing storage was kept. Ellen froze, a copper pot clutched in her hands. "Best you leave that room, ma'am. Some doors stay locked for a reason." When Anne pressed, the girl shook her head violently. "If you mean to open it, you'll not have my help, not for all the gold in London." But storms have a way of loosening tongues. That night, as the wind howled through the chimney flues and distant thunder rolled, one of the older footmen, his face lined from years of service, quietly told her the key was in the small cabinet at the end of the upper landing. The one with the painted flowers. By candlelight, Anne found it exactly where he said. The key was heavier than expected, its teeth oddly long. She crossed the East Wing corridor, the shadows seeming to lengthen around her as she approached the door. The lock turned with a sound that made her flinch. A deep metallic groan, like something waking. The hinges resisted, then yielded, revealing a room untouched by time. A child's bed stood beneath the far window, its coverlet moth-eaten but still neatly arranged. On the floor, wooden toys lay scattered as though their owner had just stepped away. The air was cold, stale, with a faint undercurrent of something damp. Anne stepped inside, her candle throwing trembling light across the walls. One of the toys, a small wooden horse, lay overturned, its paint flaked away to reveal pale wood beneath. She reached to set it upright, and the candle flame bent sharply, as if disturbed by a passing breath. The next night, as she prepared for bed, she heard it. A lullaby, sung in a voice both sweet and impossibly sad, coming from behind that same locked door. Anne did not sleep the night she heard the lullaby. She lay still beneath the covers, candlelight flickering across the ceiling, listening as the voice rose and fell beyond the wall. The melody was simple, almost childish, but carried a weight that made her chest tighten. It ended abruptly, leaving the silence heavier than before. By morning, she had convinced herself it must have been a servant, perhaps Ellen, though the girl denied it with pale cheeks and wide eyes. "I don't go near that wing, ma'am," she whispered, crossing herself before hurrying away. In the days that followed, the lullaby returned, sometimes faint, as though sung from a great distance. Other times so near she thought the door might open at any moment. Anne found herself pausing in her duties, head cocked, trying to catch every note. It was not only at night. Twice she heard it in broad daylight, drifting faintly through the corridors. She began speaking less to the servants, withdrawing into the East Wing for hours at a time. Edward noticed, though his response was irritation rather than concern. "It is a storage room, nothing more. You allow shadows and old furniture to trouble your mind," he told her. But there was an edge to his voice, not of disbelief, but of something he refused to admit. One stormy evening, Anne was discovered in the locked room itself, sitting in a small rocking chair beside the bed. The chair moved gently, creaking in rhythm, though no one's foot pushed it. She was humming the lullaby under her breath, her eyes unfocused, fixed on a corner of the room where no one else saw anything. When Edward confronted her, she seemed startled, as if waking from a dream. She was lonely, Anne murmured, brushing at her sleeve as though expecting to find a small hand there. She wanted me to stay a little longer. From that night onward, she complained of feeling cold, even beside the fire. She began wearing gloves indoors, claiming her hands ached as though chilled to the bone. Servants whispered of finding her wandering the corridors at night, speaking softly to someone who was not there. One morning, she failed to come down to breakfast. Ellen found her standing in the nursery, face pale, eyes glazed, repeating the words "mother's cold hands" over and over. Within a fortnight, Edward had her sent to Bath for rest and treatment, but the servants who saw her depart swore she was still humming that same lullaby as the carriage pulled away. And in the east wing the rocking chair kept moving long after she was gone. In the summer of 1802, Edward Hartwell married for the third time. Eliza Morton was just 20, an artist of some repute among her small circle in London. She painted landscapes in soft watercolours, gardens, riverbanks, the play of light through tree branches. It was this sensitivity to detail, Edward once told her, that had captured his admiration. Her first days at Hartwell Hall were filled with colour. She set up her easel in the gardens, entranced by the wild roses climbing the stone walls and the ancient yew trees that seemed older than the house itself. Edward, pleased with her enthusiasm, encouraged her work. The servants were polite but distant as always. At first, Eliza's paintings captured the house and grounds exactly as they appeared: formal lawns, the orchard, the hedge maze beyond. But within weeks, something began to change. On one canvas, a figure appeared near the rose arch, a slim woman in pale grey, head bowed. Eliza did not recall painting her, but assumed it was the result of some unconscious brushstroke. She painted over it. The figure returned. Sometimes it stood among the hedges, sometimes beneath a tree, always at a distance, always turned slightly away, as if half aware of the painter's gaze. Eliza, unsettled, began to leave her canvases unfinished, hiding them in the corner of her studio. One warm afternoon, she carried her easel to the maze. The sunlight was bright, the air heavy with the scent of boxwood. She began sketching the curve of a hedge when she caught movement from the corner of her eye. The pale grey woman, just ahead, vanishing around a bend. Without thinking, Eliza followed. The turns came quickly, the hedges closing in. Her heartbeat quickened. Once or twice, she caught sight of the woman's skirts disappearing around the next corner, always just beyond reach. Then came silence. When she finally emerged from the maze hours later, her dress was torn, her hands scraped from brushing against the hedges. A footman found her wandering near the orchard, pale and trembling. "I saw her," she whispered, though she could not say who she was. That night, Eliza locked her studio door. Yet in the morning, her unfinished canvas, one she had not touched in days, bore a fresh figure in pale grey, standing among the hedges, head still bowed. And this time, the face was Margaret's. After that morning, Eliza could no longer bring herself to paint the gardens. The hedges seemed taller, the paths narrower, as though the maze had subtly changed shape overnight. Even the orchard, once a place of sunlight and colour, felt dim beneath its leaves. The air smelled of damp soil, sharp and ear-so, as though it had rained though the skies were dry. But the figure in grey stayed with her. At odd moments, while crossing the hall, or looking from her bedroom window, she thought she glimpsed the pale sweep of a skirt, vanishing just beyond the line of sight. Servants claimed to have seen nothing. Edward listened politely, then told her she was romanticizing the place into a Gothic fable. One morning in late September, a thick fog rolled over the estate. It lay heavy on the grass, coiling low through the hedges, muting every sound. Eliza, restless, took her cloak and walked toward the maze, telling herself she would prove there was nothing to fear. Inside, the world became a narrow corridor of pale green and white. Each turn looked the same, the damp leaves pressing close. Her boots sank slightly into the earth with each step. Somewhere ahead, faintly, came the sound of soft footsteps, not hurried, but deliberate. "Hello?" she called, her voice muffled by the fog. No answer. She followed the sound until she saw her, the woman in grey, standing perfectly still at a junction in the path. This time her head was raised just enough for Eliza to glimpse her face. And it was unmistakably Margaret Hartwell, pale as milk, eyes dark and unblinking. Eliza's breath caught. She stepped forward, but the figure turned slowly, almost gracefully, and moved into the fog. Eliza gave chase, her heart pounding, but the hedges seemed to twist and shift, leading her in circles. When at last she stumbled into a small clearing, she was alone. The air here was colder. In the center stood a small patch of earth where nothing grew. No grass, no weeds, just bare soil, dark and freshly turned. The scent of it rose thick and cloying. She felt certain she should not be there. By the time she found her way out, the fog had thinned. A footman waiting near the garden gate stared at her seal, craped hands and mud-streaked skirts. "I saw her," Eliza said, her voice trembling. "I followed her." But she did not tell him that the ground, in that clearing, had felt warm. After the morning in the fog, Eliza seldom left the house. She claimed the light was too harsh, the air too damp, yet the real reason lay in the way the garden seemed to beckon her. From her bedroom window, she could see the top of the hedge maze. Sometimes, in the failing light, she thought she saw the pale grey woman standing at its entrance, head tilted in silent invitation. Her paintings changed. The bright colours she once favoured grew muted, the scenes stranger. One canvas showed the orchard, but the trees were twisted, their roots tangled around human bones. Another depicted the hall, yet in each shadowed corner stood a faceless figure, hands clasped as though in mourning. When Edward saw them, he ordered the canvases burned. Eliza stood watching in silence as the flames consumed her work, her expression unreadable. She began speaking of roots that grow through the soul, an odd phrase she repeated without explaining. Once Ellen found her kneeling in the parlour at dawn, pressing her palms flat against the floorboards as though listening for something beneath. Eliza's health declined. Her cheeks hollowed, her skin grew pale, and her appetite dwindled to nothing. At night, the servants heard her pacing the upper corridors, sometimes stopping outside the east wing for long minutes before moving on. One evening, she failed to appear for supper. A search found her in the orchard, lying in the damp grass, her nightdress clinging to her in the cold air. Her hands and nails were caked with soil, as if she had been digging, though no disturbed earth could be found nearby. When they brought her in, she stared at Edward without recognition and murmured, "It's deeper than you think." The next morning, she had no memory of the incident, but her skirts, freshly laundered, were once again streaked with mud by evening. Edward summoned a physician who diagnosed a nervous disorder and prescribed rest in a more temperate climate. Within a week, arrangements were made to transport her to the same Oxfordshire asylum where Margaret remained. On the day she left, Eliza paused in the doorway, looking back at the hall. "It will call for another," she said softly, though whether she spoke to Edward or to the house itself, no one could say. The carriage wheels rolled away, carrying with them the third Hartwell bride to lose herself, and in the garden the hedge maze stood quiet, as though waiting for someone else to enter. By the time Eliza was committed, whispers about Edward Hartwell had spread far beyond the village lanes. In the beginning, people spoke in hushed tones out of respect for the family name. But 3 wives, each slipping into madness, each taken away in closed carriages under guarded eyes. It was a pattern too stark to ignore. In the market square, Women leaned close to one another as they weighed produce, muttering about that house and what it does to them. Men in the tavern speculated whether Edward had married for beauty, for status, or for something darker. Some claimed he carried an illness of the spirit that seeped into anyone who shared his bed. Others muttered of a curse, old and unspoken, tied to the very land on which the manor stood. The servants at Hartwell Hall, once proud to serve a respected household, now walked with their eyes down when they came into town. Even the grocer hesitated before handing over parcels, as though afraid the contagion might pass through touch. Edward noticed the change. Invitations to dine with neighboring families dwindled. At the few gatherings he attended, conversations stilled slightly when he entered the room. Some smiled politely, but their eyes lingered on him as one might study a fox at the edge of the field. Beautiful, but dangerous. Still, he presented himself as a man wronged by fate. His posture remained impeccable, his speech refined, and he made small donations to the parish to reinforce his public image. Yet behind closed doors, his temper grew short. Ellen heard him pacing in the library long past midnight, muttering to himself, the sound of liquid being poured into glass over and over. The vicar called on him one autumn afternoon, ostensibly to offer comfort, but his questions wandered toward the house itself, whether Edward had considered selling, whether it might do him good to start afresh elsewhere. Edward's answer was swift. This land is mine. It has always been mine, and it will be mine until the last stone falls. It was that statement, repeated by the vicar in confidence to his wife, that added fuel to the fire. What bound him so fiercely to a place that seemed to devour his brides? By winter, mothers were cautioning their daughters not to take employment at Hartwell Hall, no matter the wages offered, and still the great house loomed over the fields, its chimneys smoking in the cold air, as if oblivious to the rumors swirling like frost around it. If the town expected Edward Hartwell to retreat into widowed solitude, they misjudged him. The announcement of his fourth engagement came in early spring, when the snow still clung to the hedgerows. It was not whispered. It was declared, posted in the local paper in firm black type, as though daring the reader to object. Her name was Charlotte Wynne, a woman of 26, with a reputation for wit as sharp as her cheekbones. She was not of the countryside, but from London, where the Hartwell name still carried weight untainted by rural gossip. Charlotte had met Edward at a mutual acquaintance's dinner, and within a month had accepted his proposal. The village reacted with a blend of disbelief and grim resignation. Another one, some muttered at the post office. Poor thing doesn't know what she's stepping into. Others speculate that perhaps a woman from the city might be immune to whatever plagued the manor, as though distance from the soil could protect her mind. Charlotte arrived at Hartwell Hall in a carriage far grander than any of Edward's previous brides, her trunk lined with silk gowns and volumes of poetry. She walked the front steps as though she belonged there, offering a crisp nod to the assembled staff. "I am told the gardens are the pride of the estate," she remarked to Ellen, her voice carrying the faintest note of challenge. At first she seemed unaffected by the house's peculiar weight. She filled the drawing room with laughter, organized small gatherings, and insisted the east wing be aired and opened. "It is absurd to leave a third of the house to dust," she told Edward, who merely sipped his wine and watched her with something between admiration and wariness. But small things began to change. A faint smell of smoke lingered in the corridors, though no fire had been lit. Charlotte complained of hearing music in the night. A single piano note struck over and over, never resolving into a melody. Once, while hosting tea for 2 visiting ladies, she suddenly fell silent mid-sentence, staring toward the orchard with an expression so vacant her guests later claimed they thought she had fainted standing up. Edward brushed off such incidents, yet the servants began to watch her closely. They had seen this before. The small fissures in composure, the faraway gaze, the first signs of a descent that was as predictable as the turning of seasons. And outside, in the hedge maze, a lone crow began roosting on the central stone bench, cawing at dusk, as though announcing some grim appointment yet to come. The maze had stood at the far edge of the Hartwell grounds for over a century, its yew walls grown thick and high, their dark green almost black in the shade. Few in the household venti, lured there without purpose. Fewer still lingered past sunset. Charlotte first noticed it from her bedroom window, a winding lattice of shadow and green. At breakfast, one morning, she asked Edward why it was so rarely used. "It was my grandfather's vanity," he replied curtly. "It serves no function now. You'll find it damp and overgrown." But his tone only piqued her interest. 2 days later, when Edward had gone into town, Charlotte wrapped herself in a shawl and followed the gravel path down past the orchard. The air seemed cooler there, the sound of her steps muffled by the surrounding foliage. The entrance was narrow, flanked by stone pillars weathered by rain and time. She stepped inside, brushing past leaves beaded with moisture. The paths twisted with a precision that felt deliberate, almost intelligent. She had walked perhaps 5 minutes when she heard it, a faint rustle, like skirts brushing over gravel just ahead. She quickened her pace, turned a corner, and found nothing but a wall of yew. Something about the air felt wrong, still, yet charged, as if the hedges themselves were listening. She forced a laugh at her own foolishness and retraced her steps, or tried to. The turns no longer seemed familiar, and the damp smell grew heavier, tinged with a faint sweetness that made her stomach tighten. When she finally emerged, nearly half an hour later, the sun had shifted and her shoes were soaked with dew. Ellen, passing through the orchard, paused mid-step. "Best keep away from there, ma'am," she said gently, her eyes flicking toward the maze. "It has a way of turning folk about." Charlotte smiled, but in her mind she replayed the soft rustle she had heard inside. That night, as she prepared for bed, she thought she saw something in the darkness beyond the glass, a pale flicker at the maze's entrance, vanishing when she blinked. In the weeks that followed, Charlotte found herself returning again and again, sometimes lingering just at the threshold, sometimes wandering the paths for hours. She told no one of the voices she thought she heard there, low, murmuring, almost coaxing. By midsummer, the maze was no longer merely a curiosity, it had become a summons. And though she could not have said why, Charlotte began to dread the day she might finally answer it. It began on a warm afternoon, the kind where the air hangs heavy and still, the orchard humming with the distant drone of bees. Charlotte had not intended to walk into the maze that day. She had gone merely to sit on the stone bench near its entrance, a book in hand, the sun warming her shoulders. But the breeze shifted, carrying with it a sound she could not quite place. Low, like someone speaking from far down a hallway. The words were indistinct, blurred by distance, yet they had the cadence of a conversation. She rose, leaving the book behind, and stepped past the yew pillars. The air inside was cooler, sharper. With each turn she took, the voices seemed to move ahead of her, always just out of sight. Sometimes they overlapped, 2 or 3 at once. Other times a single voice spoke slowly, almost rhythmically, as though reciting. Charlotte quickened her pace, her shoes whispering over the gravel. She turned a corner and stopped dead. The path ahead was empty, but the voice, a woman's, low and clear, was now close enough to feel in her bones. It said her name. She spun, scanning the walls of green, the pale slit of sky above. "Who's there?" she called, her voice catching slightly. No answer came, only the smell. That same faint sweetness she had noticed before seemed to grow stronger, mingled now with something older, like damp parchment. Her pulse quickened. She told herself it must be Ellen or one of the gardeners playing a trick. Yet there was no sound of retreating steps, no movement of leaves as someone slipped away. The hedges loomed, their dark surfaces unbroken, their stillness unnatural. She tried to retrace her path, but the maze shifted in her memory. Familiar corners felt wrong. The sun overhead dulled to a muted grey, as though she had stepped into a pocket of the day untouched by time. When she emerged at last, flushed and unsettled, she found Ellen waiting near the orchard with a basket of apples. The maid said nothing, but her gaze lingered on Charlotte's face as if searching for something. That night, lying in bed, Charlotte woke to the sound again, faint coaxing, as though carried through the walls themselves. Her name, spoken in that same deliberate rhythm. By morning she could no longer tell whether she had dreamt it, or if the maze had learned her name. At first, Edward did not notice the changes. Charlotte had always been a little dreamy, a little prone to losing herself in long walks or sketching in her notebook. But as the weeks passed, her silences grew longer, her gaze more distant. At dinner, she would pause mid-sentence, tilting her head as though listening to something far away. Once, during a rainstorm, he found her standing barefoot in the hallway, one hand pressed to the wall. When he asked what she was doing, she only smiled faintly and said, "It's warmer here." Edward tried to dismiss it as harmless eccentricity, but a seed of unease took root. He had lived in Hartwell Hall long enough to recognize patterns, and he had seen this pattern before. His first 3 wives had each, in their own way, begun with small, inexplicable habits. Then came the sleepless nights, the murmured replies to invisible voices, the vacant stares into dark corners. One evening, he returned from the study to find Charlotte at the window, the curtain pulled aside. She was staring into the gardens, lips moving in soundless speech. When he approached, she turned to him with a brightness in her eyes that seemed almost feverish. "They're kind to me," she said softly. "Kinder than you think." "Who?" he asked, but she only shook her head and laughed under her breath, as though the question were foolish. From that night onward, Edward began to watch her more closely. He noticed how often she wandered toward the orchard and the maze, even in poor weather. He caught her in the library reading a tattered volume of local history, tracing the illustrations of the manor's earliest days with a finger as if searching for a hidden truth. He ordered Ellen to keep her away from the maze entirely. The maid agreed, but Edward suspected she would do little to enforce it. Ellen's own feelings toward the place had always been complicated. One night, unable to sleep, Edward heard the faint creak of floorboards. He stepped into the hall to see Charlotte in her nightdress, moving toward the staircase with slow, deliberate steps. She did not turn when he called her name. When he reached her, she was pale and cold to the touch. She looked up at him then, eyes clear, and said in a voice that chilled him, "They want me to see something." The next morning, Charlotte awoke with a strange certainty, as though a decision had been made in her sleep, not by her, but for her. The day was bright, but the light felt thin, diluted, as if the sun were struggling to reach the ground. Somewhere deep in the house, she thought she heard the faint echo of footsteps, steady and measured, moving toward the gardens. After breakfast, she told Ellen she wanted to walk to the orchard. Ellen hesitated, her hands tightening around the tea tray. "Best not," she murmured, but Charlotte only smiled and stepped past her. The air outside carried that same mingled scent of sweetness and something older, like earth long undisturbed. As she approached the maze, she saw it immediately. A white ribbon tied to the low iron gate, its ends swaying slightly though no breeze stirred. The ribbon was new, unweathered, and yet she had not placed it there. She untied it, the fabric cool between her fingers, and found it folded, once around a narrow strip of parchment. The writing was precise, each letter thin and upright, the ink a deep brown that seemed too dark to be fresh. "We have been waiting." Her heart beat faster. There was no signature, no seal, no indication of who had left it. The paper smelled faintly of lavender and something metallic, like the tang of blood. She stood at the gate, the hedges beyond casting shadows that seemed to lean toward her. Charlotte told herself it was a childish trick, perhaps one of the gardeners or a local youth daring to sneak onto the grounds. Yet the certainty in the message pressed against her mind, and the sound of those distant murmuring voices seemed to rise again, low and coaxing. That evening, she tucked the ribbon and parchment into the drawer of her dressing table. She did not tell Edward. Over the next 3 nights, she dreamed the same dream, walking the maze in moonlight, the hedges taller than the house, the air filled with whispers. At the center stood a stone archway she had never seen before, its keystone carved with a symbol she could not remember upon waking. On the 4th night, She woke to find the white ribbon laid neatly on her pillow. The drawer had been locked. Ellen had been in service at Hartwell Hall since she was barely more than a child. She knew the age of every floorboard's creak, the moods of every season upon the manor's stones, and the way certain rooms grew colder after sundown. But above all, she knew to keep her tongue still when it came to the maze. For weeks she had watched Charlotte drift closer to it, the same way she had seen 4 other women drift before her. Ellen had hoped it would be different this time. Charlotte was younger, sharper, seemingly more grounded. But when she saw the white ribbon folded on Charlotte's dressing table, she felt her stomach knot. That evening, while Edward worked late in his study, Ellen brought a pot of tea to Charlotte's room and shut the door behind her. The tray rattled faintly in her hands, though she tried to see, till it. "You've been to the maze," Ellen said without preamble. Charlotte, surprised, looked up from her embroidery. "Only near it." "Why?" Ellen set the tray down and sat opposite her. "Because the maze doesn't forget. Every wife of Mr. Hartwell who set foot past that gate lost herself." Charlotte's laugh was small, uncertain. "You make it sound like a ghost story." "Stories grow from something," Ellen said sharply. "The hedges were planted over 200 years ago, on top of what was there before. There used to be a chapel, and before that, well, no one agrees. But my grandmother told me her own mother had seen the ground dug up. They found bones, Charlotte, not buried proper, scattered." Charlotte felt a prickle along her neck. "And what has that to do with me?" Ellen hesitated, her eyes flicking toward the locked drawer where the ribbon lay. "Every woman who married into this house." She started hearing things, feeling called. Some said it was the wind in the hedges, but I've heard the wind, and I've heard what comes from there. They're not the same. The tea between them had gone cold. Outside, the night pressed against the glass, the moonlight paling the gardens. Ellen leaned closer, her voice barely more than a whisper. "If you value your mind, you'll keep away from that gate. They want you for the same reason they wanted the others, and once you step too far in, you don't come back the same." Charlotte swallowed, but she did not promise. 2 days after Ellen's warning, Charlotte awoke to find the curtains in her room drawn wide, though she was certain she had latched them shut the night before. The winter air bit at her skin, and beyond the glass, the maze glistened under a thin veil of frost. Its paths looked darker, the hedges sharper, as if they had grown in the night. She tried to turn away from the window, but something caught her eye. A pale scone. You are a folded parchment resting on the sill. The paper was slightly damp, edges curling from the cold. She approached it with reluctant steps. It was not sealed. No name, no mark, just a single sheet folded twice. She hesitated, the memory of the first letter clawing at her thoughts. When she finally opened it, the handwriting was the same, thin, slanted, deliberate. "You heard her warning. She does not understand. We are not your enemy. We are what you came here for." The words seemed to hum in her hands, as if the ink itself held a vibration. She blinked, and for a heartbeat she thought she saw the faint impression of a handprint in the paper, longer, narrower than any human hand. A sound stirred behind her. She turned sharply, but the room was empty. She tucked the letter into the drawer where the ribbon lay, locking it once more. And yet, the moment the key turned, she felt as though she had shut something living inside. Downstairs, the household went about its day as though nothing were amiss. Edward was already gone to town. Ellen kept to the kitchen. The air smelled faintly of smoke from the hearth, but underneath it, Charlotte thought she caught a scent she had never noticed before. Damp earth, and something sweet, almost like crushed petals. All day, the letter weighed in her mind. She did not mention it to Ellen. She did not dare show Edward. But as dusk fell, she found herself standing at the window again, the maze waiting below, and this time she thought she saw movement. Not the wind. The air was still, but a slow, deliberate shifting, as though something were pacing inside the hedges. When she finally looked away, her breath left her in a shiver. The words from the letter still echoed, softer now, almost tender. We are what you came here for. Charlotte could no longer tell if it was a promise or a threat. That night, Charlotte's sleep was shallow, broken by the restless shifting of wind against the house. Yet each time she stirred, she realized the sound was not the wind at all. It was voices. They came as a low murmur, rising and falling like breath, too indistinct to form words, but close enough that she felt they were being spoken directly into her ear. Each time she opened her eyes, there was nothing but darkness, the kind that seems to press in from every corner of the room. When she drifted back toward sleep, the murmurs returned. This time they were accompanied by a sensation, faint but undeniable, a slow pull, like the tide drawing a ship toward shore. Her mind's eye conjured the image of the maze beneath moonlight, its paths silvered, the hedges towering higher than ever before. She saw herself standing at its entrance, barefoot, the cold earth soaking through her skin. Somewhere deep inside, a figure waited, indistinct, cloaked in shadow. She could not see its face, but she felt the weight of its gaze. She woke with a start, her nightdress damp with sweat. The house was silent, the fire in her grate reduced to a soft orange glow. She tried to steady her breathing, to convince herself it had been nothing more than a dream. But then she heard it again, a single word, spoken as though from just beyond the door. Closer. The sound was neither male nor female, neither loud nor soft, but it rooted her to the bed. She stared toward the door, waiting for it to open, but it remained shut. Her thoughts flew to the letters, to the claim that they were what she came here for. But what had she come here for? A new life, a husband, or something she could not name? She rose, crossing to the window. The frost had thickened in the night, but the moon was bright enough to illuminate the garden below. The maze lay there in perfect stillness, but the air around it seemed to waver, as though the very night bent toward it. Charlotte pressed her palm to the glass, unsure if she was seeking comfort or an answer. The word came again, this time not from the door, but from somewhere inside her own thoughts. Closer. She backed away from the window, but the pull had already taken root, and deep within, she knew the maze would not wait much longer. Ellen had been avoiding her all morning, not with open rudeness, but with a subtle, calculated skill, always finding a reason to be on the far side of the house, her footsteps soft, her eyes averted. Charlotte noticed, and it only deepened the gnawing unease that had settled over her since the night whispers. It was after luncheon, in the narrow corridor by the linen press, that Charlotte cornered her. "Ellen," she said quietly, "I know you've been keeping something from me." The maid froze, her hands still gripping the folded sheet she carried. For a moment Charlotte thought she might lie, but Ellen's shoulders sagged as though the weight she bore had grown too heavy. "You wouldn't want to hear it, ma'am," she murmured. "I must," Charlotte replied. "If you know something about this house, about the women before me, tell me." Ellen's eyes darted to the closed door at the end of the hall, as though she feared someone might be listening. She lowered her voice. "They all heard it," she said. "Every one of them. The whispers. Sometimes at night, sometimes in the maze, always telling them to go deeper." Charlotte felt her pulse quicken. Go deeper into what? Ellen shook her head, her face pale. "It's not a place, ma'am. Not only a place. It's something that knows you. Knows what you fear, what you long for. Once you step into the maze after hearing it, you don't come back the same." "And the wives?" Charlotte pressed. The maid swallowed hard. "One by one they changed. Some stopped speaking. Some laughed at nothing. One scratched the walls until her hands bled, saying she had to find the center. And when they finally broke, Mr. Hartwell sent them away, but none of them were seen again." Charlotte's throat tightened. "Where did he send them?" "I don't know," Ellen whispered. "But I know this. The maze was here long before the house. My grandmother told me her grandmother said it was already old even then. The Hartwells didn't build it. They found it. The sheet in Ellen's hand slipped to the floor. She stooped to pick it up, her fingers trembling. "Please, ma'am," she said, her voice breaking. "Don't walk it. Don't even touch the gate." But Charlotte heard the echo of that other voice, the one from the night before, curling in her mind like smoke. Closer. And in that moment, she realized Ellen's warning might have come too late. The maze had no lock, at least not one that Charlotte could see. Its entrance was an arch of overgrown yew, dark as a cave, the air beneath it cool and damp even in daylight. Yet every time she approached, something, whether superstition or unseen force, stopped her short, until the day she found the key. It was a dreary afternoon, the sky the color of tarnished pewter. Charlotte had been pacing the gallery to escape the heavy air of her chambers when her foot caught on a warped section of the floorboard. The board lifted with a faint groan, revealing a hollow space beneath. Inside lay a small, rust-flecked tin box. Her hands shook as she pried it open. Within, wrapped in a strip of yellowed linen, was an iron object. Ornate, heavy, cold. Not a key in the ordinary sense, but shaped like a ring of interlocking thorns, with a stem ending in a jagged point. When her fingers closed around it, a sensation prickled up her arm, sharp enough to draw a gasp. It was not pain exactly, but a deep electric recognition, as though the object had been waiting for her. She turned it over, noticing faint carvings along the stem. They were not letters she recognized, but curling shapes, almost plant-like, almost serpentine. And beneath them, darker still, a faint residue, as though the metal had been held by many hands, but never for long. That night, sleep refuse, but her. The key seemed to burn in her mind, even when it was locked away in her desk. When she closed her eyes, she saw the gate of the maze and the yew branches shifting, parting as if to welcome her. The next morning she tested her theory. With the key hidden in her pocket, she approached the arch. The moment she stepped into its shadow, she felt a subtle give beneath her feet. The earth itself seemed to shift, the space ahead opening in a way it never had before. The wind stirred, carrying a faint, sweet, almost rotting scent from somewhere deep inside. She reached for the key. It was warm now, warmer than her hand. From the corner of her vision, she thought she saw Ellen watching from an upstairs window, her face pale, her lips moving in silent protest. But Charlotte didn't look up. The gate was open, and the maze, older than the Hartwells, older perhaps than the town itself, was ready. The moment Charlotte stepped beneath the yew arch, the air changed. It was cooler here, damp enough that a thin film of moisture clung to her skin. The smell was strange, green and sharp, like crushed ivy, but undercut with something older, almost metallic. The ground was packed earth, though her boots sank slightly, as if the path had been softened by centuries of unseen footsteps. The hedge walls loomed on either side, higher than a man, their leaves so dense that not a single shaft of sunlight pierced through. She told herself she would take only a few steps just to see what lay beyond the entrance. But the path narrowed ahead, pulling her forward like a throat constricting around whatever entered. She turned the first corner, and froze. The maze seemed wrong. She had been certain the path curved gently left, but now it cut sharply right. The hedge wall to her left bore a fresh scar, as if something enormous had scraped along it, branches broken, leaves hanging by pale threads. Somewhere ahead a sound rose, not footsteps exactly, but a slow, deliberate rustling, as if something were shifting inside the walls themselves. Charlotte's grip tightened on the key in her pocket. She glanced back toward the entrance, but the archway was gone. In its place was another corridor, identical to the one before her, stretching away into shadow. Her heartbeat quickened. She told herself that the maze had simply twisted her sense of direction, that it was no more than an overgrown garden game. But then she noticed the air. It was moving, breathing. The faint breeze that touched her cheek did not match the movement of the leaves. She walked on, each step muffled by the damp soil. The key grew warmer in her pocket, as though aware of her hesitation. The path forked. To the right, the ground was littered with small, pale shapes. Snails, their shells broken, glistening faintly in the dim light. To the left, the earth was bare, but the air there smelled stronger, sweeter, more rotten. A whisper drifted from that direction. It was too soft to make out words, but the cadence was familiar, like Ellen murmuring in her sleep. Charlotte's mouth went dry. She took the left path. Behind her, something in the hedge shifted, the sound of countless small movements, like insects burrowing through leaves. She didn't turn around. The maze, she realized, was never meant to be entered casually. It chose when to open, and now it had closed behind her. The air in the left-hand path felt heavier, as if the hedge itself exhaled a warm, damp breath against Charlotte's skin. She moved slowly, her boots sinking deeper into the soft earth with each step. The sweet, rotten scent clung to her nostrils, coating her throat until she wanted to gag. That was when she heard them. Not just one voice now, but many. They rose and fell together, weaving into one another like a lullaby sung in a language she almost understood. The words were indistinct, blurred as though muffled by water, but the rhythm was unmistakable, slow, deliberate, drawing her forward. Charlotte stopped. The key in her pocket pulsed with warmth again, once, twice, as if reacting to the sound. She swallowed, then took a cautious step toward the hedge wall to her left. The leaves trembled. At first she thought it was the wind, but there was no breeze here. Then she saw it. Not movement from without, but from within. The dark mass behind the leaves shifted, as though hundreds of unseen bodies pressed against the living barrier, whispering through its green flesh. A phrase broke free from the murmur. "She is here." Charlotte's stomach turned to ice. The voices did not sound alarmed, nor surprised. They sounded pleased. Another step forward, and the whispers changed, overlapping, as though competing for her attention. She caught fragments. Her name, her mother's name, the name of a place she had not heard since childhood. They spoke of things she had never told anyone, memories she had locked away and never revisited. "How do you know that?" she whispered before she could stop herself. The hedge rustled violently, leaves trembling as if in laughter. A voice closer than the others, low, female, almost tender, breathed against her ear. "We have always known." Charlotte spun, but the path behind her was empty, yet she could feel it. The presence pressing closer from all directions, as though the hedge itself had leaned in to listen. She forced herself onward. The voices followed, some cajoling, some mocking, some offering comfort so sickly sweet it turned her stomach. The air thickened until each breath tasted of decay. Up ahead, the path narrowed until the walls brushed her shoulders. The whispers stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence so sudden it rang in her ears. In that silence, she realized the voices had not been random. They had been guiding her somewhere, and whatever waited just beyond the next bend was already aware she was coming. Charlotte turned the bend, and the world seemed to hold its breath. The claustrophobic walls of the hedge abruptly gave way to an open space, but not the kind she expected. This was no tidy clearing, no ornamental heart of a garden meant to impress visitors. The air here was colder, yet it smelled faintly of iron, like blood on metal. At the very center stood a structure that made no sense. It was a well, at least it resembled one, but instead of brick or stone, its circular wall was built from interlocking slabs of black slate, slick with moisture. The surface seemed to drink in the light, swallowing reflections rather than casting them. A rope hung from its beam, frayed and slick with rot, ending not in a bucket, but in a rusted hook. Charlotte's skin prickled. There was no wind, yet the rope swayed slightly, as though disturbed by something deep below. The ground around the well was wrong too. Where grass should have been, the earth was bare, cracked and strangely concave, as though countless feet had stood here for long stretches of time. And on those parched patches of soil were faint shapes, impressions of knees, hands, and even a full human outline pressed into the dirt. as though bodies had lain there unmoving for hours or days. Charlotte's pulse quickened. She forced her eyes away from the ground and toward the well's mouth. It was wider than any well she had ever seen, a yawning black circle that did not glimmer with water. The darkness within was absolute, absorbing not only the light, but her gaze itself. The longer she stared, the more it felt like the well was staring back. Then, faintly, she heard it. Drip, drip. The sound was impossibly deep, as though falling from a height that could not exist underground. The echo lasted far too long, stretching into something almost like a sigh. And with each sigh came a ripple through the air, subtle but real, as if the ground itself exhaled. Charlotte stepped closer, her boots crunching the dry soil. She leaned forward just enough to peer into the black. Something shifted far below, not water, not stone, something pale. Her breath caught. The rope swayed again, more insistently this time. From the darkness came a whisper, not from many voices, but from one, low and deliberate. Closer. Charlotte staggered back, heart pounding, but she knew the truth. She had already crossed whatever threshold this place demanded. Turning away now would not undo it. Charlotte stood frozen, her breath misting in the cold air. The whisper still clung to her ears, though the garden was utterly still. Somewhere in the distance, a raven croaked once and fell silent. Her grandmother had spoken of this place in hushed tones, but never directly. The heart of the maze is not for the living, she had once said, and Charlotte had thought it a metaphor. A turn of phrase from an old woman who liked her stories dressed in superstition. Now, with the black mouth of the well before her, she understood those words were not poetic. They were warning. She stepped forward again, unwilling yet unable to resist. The rope swayed gently, drawing her gaze downward. The darkness inside the well did not seem empty. It felt full. But full of what, she could not name. It was the kind of darkness that pressed back, that seemed to lean toward her in return. Then came the visions. They rose unbidden, like the surface of a lake disturbed by a sudden wind. She saw Eleanor Hartwell, the first wife, kneeling here, her hands clutching the stone rim until her knuckles were bloodless. Her lips moved rapidly, but no sound came, as though she were pleading with something only she could hear. Then her eyes widened, and she flung herself backward into the dirt, convulsing before fleeing into the hedges. The image dissolved. In her place was Margaret, the second wife, standing straight and still, her nightdress clinging to her from the damp mist that seemed to seep up from the well. She listened, not just with her ears, but with her entire being, her body tilting slightly toward the void. Then, without a change in expression, she placed her palm on the rope's hook, letting the rust cut into her skin. A drop of her blood fell, vanishing into the dark below. More faces came, Isabella, Jane, and finally Rose. All drawn here, all changed here. Each left with eyes too wide, movements too sharp, as though they had seen the shape of something that no mind should comprehend. Charlotte's own heart hammered against her ribs. The visions were too vivid, too complete to be imagination. She realized they were not mere memories. They were invitations. The well remembered. It wanted her to know. The drip echoed again, impossibly deep, but this time it was joined by something else. A faint, deliberate tapping from far below, like fingernails against stone. Charlotte's hand twitched toward the rope. Charlotte's fingers grazed the coarse hemp rope. It was damp, smelling faintly of rust and something older, something mineral and metallic. The cold bit through her skin, and with it came an unshakable certainty. If she pulled, the rope would not come up empty. The tapping below slowed, then stopped altogether. In its place came a long, hollow breath, rising from the depths like the exhale of something that had been waiting centuries. It seemed to pass through her chest, chilling her lungs. Her mind screamed to turn back, to flee the maze, the garden, the house. But her body refused. She leaned forward, peering into the well. The darkness inside no longer felt passive. It seemed to look back, to take her measure. She saw them again, the 5 wives. Not as they had been in life, but pale, hollow-eyed, standing in a half-circle far below. Their hair floated weightlessly around their faces, as though they stood under water. Each held out a hand toward her, the skin stretched tight over bone. Eleanor's lips moved first, the sound now reaching Charlotte's ears, in a voice that was both many and one. "We waited for you." Her pulse roared in her temples. "Why me?" she whispered. "Blood remembers. The house remembers. The well keeps its own." Charlotte's breath caught. She thought of her mother's warnings, her grandmother's muttered prayers, the way her family had always skirted this part of the garden, as if it were a sleeping animal best left undisturbed. The Hartwell curse was not about madness. Not entirely. It was about belonging to something that did not let go. The rope shifted in her grip, not with her movement, but as though it were being pulled from below, gently, insistently. She could almost feel the shape of fingers curling around the other end. A single thought crystallized in her mind. If I go, I will never return. If I stay, I will never stop hearing them. The choice was no choice at all. Charlotte stepped onto the low rim of the well. The stone was slick, worn smooth by hands and feet over generations. She closed her eyes, inhaling the damp air that smelled faintly of earth, iron, and roses. Somewhere behind her, deep in the hedges, a bird shrieked, one sharp note, and then the world was utterly silent. When the rope gave its final tug, she did not resist. The well swallowed her whole, and in the garden, the water stilled once more, waiting for the next name.